Tonight we walk into the corridors of prophecy, where echoes linger longer than footsteps, and stone walls seem to remember what men forget. Beneath the quiet cloisters of an Irish monastery lies a manuscript that has unsettled scholars, haunted popes, and stirred centuries of speculation. For nearly 900 years, it has been said to map the destiny of the Catholic Church itself, not through visions of angels or flames of revelation, but through a code of short Latin phrases so precise that those who read them felt as if time itself had been catalogued. This is not a tale of fortune-tellers or crystal spheres. It is a story of an old monk, an ancient vision, and a manuscript that the Vatican would have preferred never to see the light again. It is about St. Malachy of Armagh, the 12th century reformer who, according to legend, looked into the ages and saw the faces of popes yet unborn. To understand the prophecy, we must first understand the prophet. Malachy O'Morgair was born in 1094 in Armagh, the ancient ecclesiastical capital of Ireland. He came of age during a turbulent period when the Irish Church was struggling to align itself with Roman practice while maintaining its distinctive Celtic traditions. The Ireland of his youth was a patchwork of monasteries and dioceses, some dating back to the age of Patrick himself, others barely organised according to the continental model Rome expected. Malachy was ordained young and rose quickly through ecclesiastical ranks, not through ambition, but through evident holiness. Contemporary accounts describe him as a man of severe discipline, given to long fasts and longer prayers. He wore hair shirts beneath his vestments, and often spent entire nights prostrate before the altar. Yet he was no recluse. His reforms brought order to chaotic dioceses. His preaching drew crowds, and his reputation for miracles spread across the Irish countryside. By 1132, he had been appointed Archbishop of Armagh, the highest ecclesiastical office in Ireland. But his tenure was contested. The position had been treated as hereditary by certain powerful families, and Malachy's reformist zeal made him enemies. He resigned the primacy after only 3 years, accepting instead the humbler see of Down, where he could focus on building a community according to the strict Augustinian rule he admired. It was during this period of consolidation that he decided to travel to Rome. He sought papal approval for his reforms and hoped to bring the Cistercian monastic rule to Ireland. The journey would be long and dangerous. Across the Irish Sea, through Britain, across the Channel to France, and then over the Alps into Italy. Few Irish clerics of the time had made such a pilgrimage. The year was 1139. Malachy set out with a small retinue of monks, travelling first to Scotland, then southward through England. In France, he stopped at Clairvaux, where he met Bernard, the great Cistercian abbot who would later become his biographer. Bernard was immediately struck by the Irish archbishop, describing him as a man in whom God's grace shone visibly. The two men formed an instant bond. Bernard saw in Malachy the kind of apostolic simplicity he believed the Church had lost. Malachy saw in Bernard the spiritual intensity he hoped to transplant to Ireland. They parted as friends, with Malachy promising to return and bring Irish monks to study the Cistercian way. From Clairvaux, Malachy continued south toward Rome. It was somewhere on this road, perhaps in the foothills of the Alps, perhaps along the ancient Via Francigena that pilgrims had walked for centuries, that the vision came. According to later accounts, Malachy had stopped to pray at a wayside chapel. He was alone, his companions having gone ahead to secure lodging for the night. As he knelt before a crude wooden crucifix, a sudden stillness fell over him. The sounds of the road, birds, wind, the distant voices of travellers, faded into silence. Then the images began. Faces appeared before his inner eye, one after another, each wearing the triple tiara of the papal office. Some faces were kind, others stern. Some were young, others ancient. They came in succession, a procession of men he did not recognize, each bearing symbols he could not fully understand. Castles, stars, animals, flowers, mountains, seas. With each face came words, not spoken aloud but impressed directly upon his mind. Brief Latin phrases, cryptic yet precise. Ex castro Tiberis, inimicus expulsus, lux in caelo, religio depopulata. The phrases poured forth like water from a broken vessel, faster than he could process them, yet each one seared into his memory with perfect clarity. He saw empires rise and crumble. He saw cathedrals built and burned. He saw wars that would scar continents and councils that would reshape doctrine. Through it all, the Church endured, sometimes barely, sometimes triumphantly, but always present, always continuing. The vision lasted hours, or perhaps only minutes. Time itself seemed unreliable. When it finally subsided, Malachy found himself collapsed on the stone floor of the chapel, his body drenched in sweat despite the cool mountain air. His hands trembled as he reached for parchment and quill. What he recorded was not a sermon or a prophecy in the poetic style of Isaiah or Ezekiel. It was a list, spare, orderly, unnervingly systematic. 112 brief Latin phrases, each describing a future pope, not by name, but by essence. Where he came from, what symbol defined his rule, what crisis would mark his reign. The first motto read, Ex castro Tiberis, from the castle on the Tiber. Malachy had no idea what it meant. 4 years later, in 1143, Celestine II ascended to the papacy. He was Guido di Castello, a man whose family name literally meant castle and whose ancestral fortress overlooked the Tiber River. The coincidence was exact enough to unsettle even skeptics. Malachy arrived in Rome and presented his reforms to Pope Innocent II, who received him warmly. The Irish archbishop also presented his manuscript, the record of his vision. According to fragments of correspondence that survive, Innocent was intrigued but cautious. Prophecy was always a delicate matter. The Church had been burned before by false visionaries and apocalyptic fantasies. Innocent accepted the document and placed it in the papal archives. There it would remain, largely forgotten, for over 4 centuries. Why did the manuscript disappear? Several theories exist. Some historians suggest it was deliberately suppressed because it unsettled the papal court. After all, to claim foreknowledge of future popes was to imply their election was predetermined, which raised uncomfortable questions about free will and divine election. Others believe it was simply misfiled and lost amid the thousands of documents flowing through the Vatican each year. A third possibility is more intriguing, that certain officials recognized its potential power and chose to keep it hidden until a time when it might serve a useful purpose. Prophecy, after all, can be a weapon. Release it at the right moment, and it can legitimize or delegitimize, inspire or terrify. Whatever the reason, the manuscript slept. Malachy himself never saw it published. He returned to Ireland, established the Cistercian presence he had dreamed of, and died in 1148 at Clairvaux in the arms of his friend Bernard. He was canonized in 1190, not for his prophecies, but for his reforms and reported miracles. The prophecy waited. On a spring day in 1595, a Benedictine historian named Arnold de Wyon was working in the Vatican archives, compiling material for his Lignum Vitae, a comprehensive catalogue of saints and holy figures. He was deep in the stacks, sorting through bundles of medieval manuscripts, when he discovered a thin sheaf of parchment bearing an unfamiliar title, Prophetia S. Malachii Archiepiscopi, De Summis Pontificibus. The prophecy of Saint Malachy, archbishop concerning the supreme pontiffs. De Wyon was immediately intrigued. He had read Bernard of Clairvaux's biography of Malachy and knew of the Irish saint's reputation for visions, but this document was unknown to him. He carefully transcribed the text and decided to include it in his publication. When Lignum Vitae appeared later that year, the Malachy prophecies created an immediate sensation. Scholars, clergy, and the curious rushed to obtain copies. They began testing the predictions against the historical record. The results were startling. Each pope from Celestine II onward seemed to match his assigned motto with uncanny precision. It wasn't just that the phrases could be interpreted to fit. They seemed specifically crafted for each pontiff, capturing not just biographical details, but the essence of their reigns. De Antiquitate Urbis, from the antiquity of the city, described Urban VII, who had served as governor of Rome before his election. Pia Civitas in Bello, pious city in war, matched Gregory XIV, whose brief reign from 1590 to 1591 was consumed by the religious wars tearing Europe apart. De Lilio et Rosa, of the Lily and the Rose, seemed to unfold perfectly in Urban VIII, whose family crest bore 3 bees, but whose beautification of Baroque Rome filled the city with lily and rose motifs. Critics immediately cried fraud. De Wyon, they argued, had forged the entire document, crafting mottos to fit popes who had already reigned. It would have been relatively easy. Look back at 40 or 50 popes, find identifying details, create cryptic Latin phrases that seemed prophetic in hindsight. The accusation was plausible. De Wyon had both the knowledge and the opportunity. He was a trained historian with access to papal biographies and Vatican records. He could have manufactured the entire prophecy over a few months of careful work. But this theory faced one insurmountable problem: time itself. If Arnold de Wyon had forged the prophecies in 1595, crafting mottos to fit popes of his own era, the fraud should have collapsed immediately. New popes elected after 1595 should have borne no resemblance to the remaining mottos on the list. The pattern should have broken. It didn't. Pope after pope continued to match their assigned phrases with the same eerie precision. Popes of the 17th century, the 18th, the 19th, each seemed to fulfill prophecies supposedly written 400 years earlier, or by another reckoning, nearly 500 years earlier, if one believed Malachy's authorship. Gens Perversa, Perverse Nation, described Paul V, 1605 to 1621, who fought bitter conflicts with Venice and England, both of which had defied papal authority. Montium Custos, Guardian of the Mountains, fit Alexander VII, 1655 to 1667, perfectly. His family, the Chigi, came from mountainous Siena, and his papacy was defined by defending the Papal States from armies pressing down from the northern hills. Peregrinus Apostolicus, Apostolic Pilgrim, seemed impossibly precise for Pius VI, 1775 to 1799, the Pope who was carried into exile by Napoleon's armies and died on foreign soil, a literal pilgrim to the end. Aquila Rapax, Rapacious Eagle, described Pius VII, 1800 to 1823, whose reign was dominated by his struggle with Napoleon Bonaparte, whose imperial symbol was the eagle. The matches continued through the 19th century. Lumen in Caelo, Light in the Sky, captured Leo XIII, 1878 to 1903, famed for his brilliant mind and his encyclicals that illuminated the Church's role in the modern world. Ignis Ardens, Burning Fire, described Pius X, 1903 to 1914, whose passionate reform of liturgy and fierce campaign against modernist theology earned him the name the Fire of Rome. By the dawn of the 20th century, even hardened skeptics had to admit the pattern was extraordinary. Statistical analyses attempted to calculate the probability of such consistent matches occurring by chance. The numbers were astronomical, odds so long they effectively approached impossibility. Either an Irish monk in 1139 had genuinely glimpsed the future, or Arnold de Wyon in 1595 had been impossibly prescient about popes who wouldn't be born for centuries, or something else entirely was at work. Something the rational mind struggled to categorize. As the list progressed into the 20th century, awareness of the prophecies grew. Each papal election now unfolded with commentators waiting to see if the pattern would hold. Newspapers published the next motto in sequence alongside speculation about which cardinal might fulfill it. The prophecy had entered popular consciousness. Benedict XV, 1914 to 1922, was assigned Religio Depopulata, religion laid waste. His papacy coincided almost exactly with World War I, which devastated Europe and left much of the Christian world spiritually and physically ruined. Entire villages were erased. Churches that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Pius XI, 1922 to 1939, bore the motto Fides Intrepida, intrepid faith. His reign saw him confront fascism, communism, and totalitarianism with unprecedented boldness. He signed the Lateran Treaty that established Vatican City as an independent state, securing the Church's autonomy even as dictators rose around him. Pastor Angelicus, angelic shepherd, described Pius XII, 1939 to 1958, whose papacy spanned World War II. The phrase took on haunting resonance as he guided the Church through literal fire and darkness. Whether his actions during the Holocaust were angelic or inadequate remains debated, but the motto's connection to his wartime leadership was undeniable. John XXIII, 1958 to 1963, was pastor et nauta, shepherd and sailor. The connection seemed almost too literal. He had served as Patriarch of Venice, a city defined by its relationship to the sea. But the phrase proved prophetic in a deeper sense. He would navigate the Church through the turbulent waters of the Second Vatican Council, steering it toward modernity despite tremendous resistance from traditionalists. Paul VI, 1963 to 1978, was Flos Florum, flower of flowers. His family crest bore 3 lilies. His papacy, often described as flowering with both renewal and controversy, implemented the reforms of Vatican II, while grappling with dissent, modernization, and the sexual revolution that transformed Western culture. Then came the 33-day Pope. John Paul I was elected on August 26, 1978. His motto was De Medietate Lunae, of the half moon. Most expected the phrase to refer to something in his background or coat of arms. Instead, it seemed to predict his reign itself. He died suddenly on September 28th, exactly 33 days after his election. Researchers later confirmed that his papacy began the day after a half moon and ended the day before the next half moon. His entire reign unfolded between 2 lunar halves. The coincidence was so precise, it sent shockwaves through both believers and skeptics. Conspiracy theories exploded. Had he been murdered to fulfill the prophecy? Had the cardinals who elected him known what the motto implied? The Vatican's awkward handling of the death, including contradictory statements about who found the body and what he was reading when he died, only fueled speculation. For believers in Malachy's vision, John Paul I's death was the most unsettling proof yet. The prophecy had predicted not just a pope's origin or symbol, but the very nature and duration of his reign. And it had been right to the day. John Paul II, 1978 to 2005, bore the motto De Labora Solis, of the labor of the sun, or from the sun's eclipse. The interpretation seemed straightforward. He was born on the day of a solar eclipse in 1920 and would be buried during another in 2005. His papacy was the second longest in history, and he travelled more extensively than any pope before him, labouring under the sun of every continent. But the phrase held deeper resonance. His pontificate saw the collapse of Soviet communism, an ideology he had laboured against his entire life. He survived an assassination attempt in 1981 that many attributed to communist forces. He worked tirelessly to reshape the Church's relationship with Judaism, Islam, and Orthodox Christianity. When he died in 2005, the solar eclipse occurred over the Pacific Ocean, visible from nowhere in Europe. Yet the symbolism remained. A pope whose life had been marked by celestial events, whose labor had been global, whose reach had extended to every place the sun touched. Benedict XVI, 2005 to 2013, was Gloria Olivae, glory of the olive. Scholars immediately noted he had chosen the name Benedict, connecting him to the Benedictine order, specifically the Olivetan branch. His papacy pursued reconciliation with Judaism, the olive branch between ancient faiths, but perhaps the most prophetic aspect of Gloria Olivae was what it represented: peace, completion, the offering of an olive branch before something ends. In February 2013, Benedict did something no pope had done in 600 years. He resigned. The announcement shocked the world. Popes served until death. That was the tradition, the expectation, almost the definition of the office. But Benedict, citing age and declining strength, stepped down voluntarily. He became Pope Emeritus, living in quiet retirement within Vatican walls, while his successor took the chair of Peter. For those counting the prophecies, this was the penultimate entry. 111. The olive had been extended. What came next was the final line. Malachy's final prophecy broke the pattern. Unlike the terse mottos before it, the last entry unfolded in a full paragraph. In persecutione extrema essar, e sedebet Petrus Romanus, qui pascet, oves, in multes tribulationibus, quaebus transactis civitas septicollis diruetur, et judex tremendus judicabit populum suum. In the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, there will reign Peter the Roman, who will feed his flock amid many tribulations, after which the city of 7 hills shall be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge his people. Unlike the preceding lines, this was not a concise motto, but an apocalyptic vision. It described no crest, no birthplace, no symbolic animal or plant. Instead, it spoke of persecution, tribulation, destruction, and judgment. When Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio of Argentina was elected Pope in March 2013, taking the name Francis, the world held its breath. Was he the final Pope? Was this the beginning of the end? Francis was not named Peter. His origins were not explicitly Roman, yet certain details gave pause to those who believed. He was the first Jesuit Pope, from the Society of Jesus, an order founded specifically to serve and protect the Roman Church. His name honored Francis of Assisi, but his papal role made him the shepherd of Rome. In a symbolic sense, every pope is Peter, the rock on which Christ built his church. Some argued that Francis represented an unwritten interlude, a bridge between Gloria Olivae and the true Petrus Romanus yet to come. Others insisted he fulfilled the prophecy in essence, if not in name. Still others suggested the final prophecy was symbolic rather than literal, that Peter the Roman represented not one man but the church itself in its final form, returning to apostolic simplicity. The Vatican, predictably, said nothing official. But within St. Peter's Square, among the pilgrims and the faithful, the question lingered. Are we witnessing the final chapter? The Catholic Church has never officially endorsed the Malachy prophecies. Its position, carefully maintained across centuries, can be summarized in one phrase: prudent skepticism. The Catechism of the Catholic Church makes clear that while private revelations are possible, God can and does communicate with individuals. Such revelations are never binding on the faithful. They can help us live more fully according to the gospel in a particular era, but they do not improve or complete Christ's definitive revelation. In other words, private prophecy, even if genuine, adds nothing to what must be believed. This theological framework gives the Church maximum flexibility. It can acknowledge that Malachy may have experienced a genuine vision without committing to the prophecy's accuracy. It can recognize the historical curiosity of the manuscript without endorsing it as divine truth. It can allow believers to find meaning in the patterns without requiring everyone to accept them. In practice, this means Vatican officials deflect questions about the prophecies with pastoral gentleness. When journalists ask, they receive variations of the same answer. The Church's future is in God's hands, not in medieval manuscripts. We trust in providence, not prediction, yet behind this public stance lies a more complex reality. The Vatican has studied the manuscript repeatedly over the centuries, not to verify its divine origin, but to understand its influence and authenticity. The first major internal investigation occurred in the early 17th century, shortly after de Wyan's publication. Pope Paul V assigned the motto gens perversa and engaged in bitter conflicts with Venice and Protestant powers, ordered a small commission to examine the manuscript's origins. Their conclusion, preserved in fragmentary notes discovered centuries later, was cautious. The prophecies may be ancient, or they may be recent invention. Their accuracy regarding popes past the year 1595 will prove or disprove their source. Until then, we reserve judgment. It was a reasonable position. Let time be the test. Time obliged. As new popes continued matching their mottos, subsequent pontiffs quietly ordered new examinations. In the 18th century, during the Enlightenment's height, Benedict XIV, himself a scholar and historian, commissioned a study comparing the manuscript's Latin to authenticated 12th century Irish texts. The linguistic analysis found the style plausible, though not definitive. In the late 19th century, Leo XIII, the light in the sky, whose own fulfillment of prophecy was so striking, ordered the most comprehensive study yet. The commission included paleographers, theologians, and historians. They examined the physical manuscript, compared it to other documents of the period, and analysed its content. Their report, portions of which surfaced decades later, confirmed that the manuscript's vellum and core ink dated to the 12th century. The handwriting matched Irish monastic scripts of Malachy's era, but they noted irregularities in the final paragraph, the apocalyptic prophecy about Petrus Romanus. The ink there seemed slightly different, the hands slightly larger, as though written under different circumstances, or perhaps even at a different time. The Commission's final statement was deliberately ambiguous. The document appears substantially authentic to its claimed period, with anomalies requiring further study. Further study came in the 20th century. In the 1980s, during a routine preservation effort, Vatican archivists used new technologies to examine the manuscript. Spectral imaging, which captures how documents reflect and absorb different wavelengths of light, revealed details invisible to the naked eye. The results confirmed the core text dated to the 12th century. The vellum was genuine calfskin prepared using medieval techniques. The primary ink matched recipes known from Irish monasteries of that era, composed of oak gall, ferrous sulfate, and gum arabic. But the final prophecy, the paragraph about Petrus Romanus, presented problems. Infrared analysis showed it had been written with ink chemically distinct from the rest. While the base components were similar, the final section's ink contained trace elements that shouldn't exist in any known medieval formula: manganese oxide in unusual concentrations, minute crystalline compounds of uncertain origin, and microscopic metallic particles that gave the ink an almost iridescent quality under certain wavelengths. When archivists attempted to replicate the ink using period-appropriate materials, they couldn't reproduce these properties. The anomalous elements seemed either to indicate later tampering or to suggest a preparation method more sophisticated than historical records could explain. Carbon dating of the different ink samples yielded frustrating results. Multiple tests on the same material produced inconsistent dates, with margins of error spanning centuries. Some samples seemed genuinely 12th century, others tested inconclusively. The variation itself was unusual. Normally, carbon dating of medieval documents produces consistent results. The technical team's conclusion, filed in a classified report: origin uncertain. Physical anomalies present. Recommend continued observation. That recommendation was followed in 2014. Following Benedict XVI's unprecedented resignation and Francis's election, events that brought the prophecies back into global headlines, the Vatican assembled a new investigative team. They called their project Veritas Temporis, the truth of time. This commission included not just historians and theologians, but also data scientists, statisticians, and materials engineers. Their mandate was to use every available 21st century tool to determine the manuscript's authenticity and explain its patterns. The team employed 3D scanning to create precise models of the manuscript's physical structure. They used multispectral imaging to examine every layer of the document. They subjected the inks to mass spectrometry. They analyzed the text using computational linguistics. They even examined the manuscript under electron microscopy to study individual fibers and particles. While most of their findings remain classified, fragments leaked to journalists paint a fascinating picture. First, they confirmed again that the core manuscript was genuinely medieval. The vellum's collagen structure matched samples from 12th century Irish monasteries. The wear patterns, folding marks, and aging were consistent with 900 years of careful storage. Second, they discovered microscopic patterns within the vellum itself, geometric designs invisible without ultraviolet light. These patterns, when mapped, resembled Celtic knotwork intertwined with mathematical spirals. The precision was remarkable, suggesting either highly sophisticated medieval craftsmanship or some form of natural crystalline patterning in the material itself. Third, and most intriguingly, they found temporal patterns in the prophecies themselves. The statistical team analysed the intervals between papal elections from Celestine II forward. They converted these intervals into numerical sequences and looked for patterns. What they found was extraordinary. The spacing between popes didn't follow random distribution. Instead, election intervals clustered according to mathematical ratios similar to those found in sacred geometry, particularly the Fibonacci sequence and the Golden ratio. Major crises in church history, the Great Schism, the Reformation, the French Revolution, Vatican II, occurred at intervals that mirrored these same ratios. More striking, when they analysed the length and complexity of each motto against the duration and significance of each corresponding papacy, they found statistical correlations that exceeded random chance by orders of magnitude. The team's internal memo, leaked in 2018, stated, "The prophecies display non-random patterning suggesting either extraordinary prescience, post hoc manipulation of church history to fit predictions, or mathematical encoding by unknown means. All three possibilities present significant epistemological challenges. In simpler terms, the patterns were real and couldn't be easily explained." One researcher proposed what he called the resonance hypothesis, that the manuscript didn't predict the future so much as establish a pattern that future generations unconsciously followed. The prophecies, in this view, acted like a seed crystal in a super-saturated solution, organizing random events into coherent structure simply by existing. Another suggested retrocausality, that future events somehow influenced past documentation, creating a feedback loop across time itself. This theory, while intriguing, ventured so far into metaphysics that most of the team dismissed it. A third possibility, discussed only in private, was more disturbing: that an organization or network had deliberately guided papal elections over centuries to fulfill the prophecies, turning Malachy's vision into a self-fulfilling script. This would require coordination spanning generations, but it wasn't impossible. The Church itself had demonstrated institutional memory and strategic planning across similar timescales. No consensus emerged. The Commission eventually disbanded, their official conclusion identical to that of their predecessors. Origin uncertain. Continued study warranted. Beyond questions of authenticity lay deeper theological concerns. If Malachy's prophecies were genuine divine revelation, what did that mean for the Church's understanding of free will, providence, and succession? Catholic theology holds that the Holy Spirit guides the College of Cardinals in selecting each pope. This guidance doesn't override free will. The cardinals still choose freely, and their political maneuvering, personal preferences, and human flaws all play roles. The Holy Spirit's work is subtle, ensuring that despite all the messiness of human decision-making, the right person emerges for that particular moment in history. But if every pope was pre-written in 1139, what room remained for that free choice? If Celestine II was destined to be from the castle on the Tiber, did the cardinals really choose him? Or were they merely executing a script written 8 centuries earlier? Some theologians argued that prophecy and free will weren't contradictory, that God, existing outside time, could foresee choices freely made without causing them. From an eternal perspective, the cardinals' free election in 1143 and Malachy's vision in 1139 were simultaneous events. The vision didn't cause the choice, it simply perceived it from a different temporal vantage point. Others found this explanation unsatisfying. Perfect foreknowledge, they argued, negates meaningful choice. If God knew with certainty that Celestine II would be elected, then in what sense did the cardinals choose? Their decision was predetermined, even if they felt free while making it. A third group proposed that the prophecies weren't divine revelation at all, but something stranger, a form of collective unconscious archetypal patterns that human institutions naturally follow. The Church, in this view, was acting out deep psychological scripts, and Malachy's genius was recognizing and articulating those patterns. This debate continued in seminaries and theological journals, but it never reached official resolution. The Vatican's position remained what it had always been. The prophecies were interesting but not binding, curious but not dogma. Perhaps the most compelling explanation for the prophecy's accuracy is also the most mundane. They work because people make them work. Consider how the process unfolds. A pope dies or resigns. The College of Cardinals gathers to elect a successor. Before they enter conclave, the entire Catholic world knows what Malachy's next motto is. Journalists print it. Commentators speculate about which candidates might fulfill it. The cardinals themselves, whether they admit it or not, are aware of the prophecy. Now imagine you're a cardinal. You're debating between candidates. One is from a coastal region, another from the mountains. The next motto happens to be Montium Custos, guardian of the mountains. Consciously or not, the mountain connection influences your thinking. Perhaps you mention it in conversation with other cardinals. Perhaps they've thought of it too. The mountain candidate is elected. Commentators marvel at how perfectly he fulfills the prophecy. But did he fulfill it, or was he chosen partly because of it? This dynamic, prophecy influencing the events it supposedly predicts, is called a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's well documented in psychology, economics, and sociology. Announce that a bank is failing, and depositors rush to withdraw funds, actually causing the failure. Predict that a stock will rise and investors buy it, driving up the price. The Malachy prophecies may work the same way. For 900 years, they've been part of the Church's collective consciousness. Every papal election unfolds with those ancient words hovering in the background. Cardinals who consciously reject such superstition may still be unconsciously influenced by them. And once a pope is elected, his followers help him embody his motto, emphasizing aspects of his background or papacy that fit the prediction, downplaying those that don't. Over time, the prophecy becomes self-reinforcing. Each fulfillment makes the next one more likely, not because of divine predestination, but because of human psychology. This explanation has the virtue of not requiring miracles, time travel, or conspiracy. It requires only human nature, our tendency to find patterns, to fulfill expectations, to make meaning from ancient texts. Yet even this explanation has its limits. How do we account for John Paul I's 33-day papacy falling precisely between half moons? Did the cardinals who elected him know he would die in a month? Did they choose him to fulfill the prophecy? And if so, how did they arrange his death? The self-fulfilling prophecy model works for most of the list, but certain fulfillments seem too precise, too beyond human control, to fit neatly into psychological explanation. In 2019, a retired Jesuit historian gave an interview that offered a different perspective. Father Thomas Rees, who had spent decades studying church history, was asked about the Malachy prophecies. His answer was characteristically thoughtful. Prophecy may not be about predicting the future. It may be about understanding the present so deeply that you can see where it's heading. Malachy looked at the church of his time, its strengths, its weaknesses, its patterns, and extrapolated forward. What we call prophecy might simply be profound historical insight. He continued, think of it as memory written forward. Malachy remembered the church's past so completely that he could project its future. The mottos aren't supernatural visions but sophisticated pattern recognition. He saw that the church moves in cycles, that certain types of leaders emerge at certain types of moments, and he coded that knowledge into brief phrases that would make sense when the time came. This interpretation reframes the entire phenomenon. Instead of a mystic receiving visions from God, we have a historian and reformer who understood institutional dynamics so thoroughly he could map them centuries ahead. Instead of supernatural revelation, we have natural genius. It's a compelling theory, though it struggles to explain the prophecy's specificity. Even the most brilliant historical analyst couldn't predict that a pope 500 years in the future would be born during a solar eclipse and buried during another. Pattern recognition only goes so far, yet perhaps specificity isn't the point. Perhaps the prophecies work not because each detail is literally accurate, but because they're archetypal enough to apply across contexts. Guardian of the Mountains could describe many candidates. All you need is some connection to mountains, elevation, or defense, and the motto fits. In this view, the prophecies are less prediction and more poetry. Evocative phrases that resonate with multiple meanings, allowing each generation to find its truth within them. Whatever their origin or mechanism, the Malachy prophecies have entered our time with peculiar intensity. The approaching end of the list, whether we're at it or near it, has given the manuscript urgency it never quite had before. For centuries, the prophecies were a curiosity. Now they feel like a countdown. The difference is profound. When the list stretched into an indefinite future, it could be contemplated philosophically. But with only 1 or 2 entries remaining, speculation transforms into anticipation, and for some, into anxiety. Pope Francis has addressed eschatological speculation repeatedly, always with the same pastoral redirection. In a 2015 homily, he said, "Some people are always looking for dates, for signs, for the end. But Jesus told us clearly, the kingdom of God is already among you. The end is not something to calculate, it's something to prepare for through love and service." In another address, he was more direct. The end of something holy is not ruin, but revelation. We are not closing the book, we are turning the page. The phrase resonated deeply. Within weeks, banners bearing Revelatio, non ruina, revelation, not ruin, appeared among pilgrims in St. Peter's Square. It became a kind of motto for those who believed in the prophecies but rejected apocalyptic fear. Even in uncertainty, a message of hope Francis's papacy has been marked by reform, controversy, and a persistent effort to refocus the Church on mercy rather than judgment, on the peripheries rather than the centre. Whether this makes him Petrus Romanus or a predecessor to that final figure remains debated. But his consistent message has been clear. Whatever comes next, face it with faith, not fear. By the early 21st century, the Malachy prophecies had fully entered popular culture. They appeared in novels, films, documentaries, and endless online discussions. Conspiracy theorists wove them into elaborate narratives about secret societies and apocalyptic timelines. New Age spiritualists interpreted them as evidence of cosmic cycles coming to completion. Even secular media used the language of prophecy when covering Vatican events. When Francis was elected, major newspapers ran headlines like "The Last Pope" and "Prophecy Points to End Times." The manuscript, whether authentic or not, had become a lens through which millions viewed the Catholic Church. This globalization of awareness created its own feedback loop. The more people believed in the prophecies, the more attention they paid to papal events, the more meaning they found in every papal action or statement. Francis couldn't sneeze without someone interpreting it as a sign of tribulation. For Vatican officials, this presented both challenge and opportunity. On one hand, apocalyptic speculation distracted from the Church's actual work and mission. On the other hand, it kept people engaged with the papacy in an age when institutional religion was declining across the developed world. Some progressive Catholics hoped the end, predicted by Malachy, meant not destruction, but transformation. The end of the Church's monarchical structure, perhaps, or the end of clerical celibacy, or the beginning of women's ordination. The prophecy, in this reading, described not catastrophe, but necessary change, the death of old forms and the birth of new ones. Conservative Catholics feared exactly that. To them, tribulation and the destruction of the seven-hilled city sounded like the dissolution of tradition, the surrender of doctrine, the accommodation to secular culture they had long resisted. The prophecy confirmed their worst fears about where the modern Church was heading. Both groups projected their hopes and anxieties onto the ancient manuscript, making it a mirror of contemporary Catholic tensions. Inside the Vatican, a pragmatic approach prevailed. Whether or not the prophecies were true, the Church needed to prepare for an uncertain future. The 21st century had brought challenges previous generations never imagined. Global communication that spread scandal instantaneously, declining vocations in the West, rising secularism, sexual abuse crises that shattered institutional credibility. In this context, the Malachy prophecies became less about supernatural prediction and more about strategic planning. If the manuscript suggested major transformation ahead, whether through divine intervention or historical inevitability, then the Church needed to be ready. Beginning in the early 2000s, the Vatican quietly modernized its infrastructure. Digital archives were created to preserve essential documents. Communication systems were upgraded to function independently of commercial networks. Emergency protocols were established for maintaining Church governance during global disruptions. Publicly, these were described as routine upgrades. Privately, officials sometimes referenced continuity planning and institutional resilience, bureaucratic language that, to those listening carefully, suggested preparation for significant change. In 2016, Francis established a commission to study the Church's future organizational structures. Its mandate was to imagine how Catholicism might function in scenarios ranging from continued gradual decline in Europe to catastrophic collapse of global systems to rapid growth in the global South, requiring new forms of governance. The Commission's work remained largely confidential, but leaked excerpts revealed fascinating discussions. One memo explored non-territorial dioceses organized around linguistic or cultural communities rather than geography. Another examined distributed authority models that would allow the Church to function even if Rome became inaccessible. A third, titled Continuity of Apostolic Succession in Extraordinary Circumstances, addressed how papal succession might work if traditional conclave procedures became impossible. None of these documents mentioned Malachy explicitly, but the timing, coming as the prophecies approached their conclusion, seemed more than coincidental. Perhaps the deepest question raised by the Malachy prophecies is not whether they're true, but what the end means. Western culture tends to view endings as termination, conclusion, death. The apocalyptic tradition, from Revelation to modern disaster films, emphasizes destruction, judgment, finality. If Malachy predicted the end of the papacy, we assume he meant its extinction. But other traditions understand endings differently. In Eastern philosophy, endings are transformations, the completion of one cycle and the beginning of another. In biology, death is necessary for new life. In Christian theology itself, resurrection requires crucifixion. Easter requires Good Friday. What if the end Malachy foresaw was not destruction but metamorphosis? What if the tribulation facing Petrus Romanus was not the Church's death, but its rebirth? Throughout history, the Catholic Church has survived countless ends. It survived the fall of Rome. It survived the Great Schism. It survived the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, fascism, communism. Each time, voices proclaimed the Church's end. Each time, it endured, but never unchanged. Perhaps the prophecy's real meaning lies there. Not in predicting a final pope, but in reminding each generation that the Church must always be willing to die to itself, to let go of forms that no longer serve, to embrace transformation rather than cling to preservation. In this reading, Petrus Romanus is not a person, but a principle. The Church returning to its apostolic roots, stripped of temporal power and institutional complexity, reduced once again to the simple commission Christ gave Peter, "Feed my sheep." The destruction of the seven-hilled city need not be literal. Rome has been sacked, burned, and devastated repeatedly throughout history, yet it endures. Perhaps the prophecy describes not physical destruction, but the end of Rome as the center of Catholic identity. A decentralization that reflects the Church's increasingly global and multicultural reality. The dreadful judge might not be an external force, but the Church judging itself, confronting its failures, and choosing repentance over defensiveness. This symbolic reading preserves the prophecy's power while avoiding apocalyptic literalism. It allows Malachy's vision to be both true and hopeful. True in its recognition that major change approaches, hopeful in its suggestion that what comes after the end might be renewal rather than ruin. The manuscript remains where it has been for decades, secured in the climate-controlled chambers beneath the Vatican Library, accessible only to authorized scholars and conservators. Its parchment has yellowed with age, but remains intact. The Latin phrases, written in fading brown ink, are still legible after 9 centuries. No definitive pronouncement has been made about its authenticity. The Church continues its centuries-old policy, neither confirming nor condemning, neither embracing nor rejecting. The prophecies exist in theological limbo, acknowledged but not endorsed, studied but not celebrated. Perhaps that ambiguity is precisely the point. The Malachy prophecies, authentic or forged, divinely inspired or humanly crafted, have served a function beyond their content. They have reminded the Church of its mortality, its contingency, its place within time rather than above it. They have prompted believers to contemplate endings and beginnings, judgment and mercy, human free will and divine providence. They have also revealed something about human nature itself. Our compulsion to find patterns, our hunger for meaning, our terror and fascination with the future. We are creatures who tell stories about time because we are trapped within it. And prophecy is the ultimate story, the claim that someone, somewhere, has escaped our temporal prison and seen what lies ahead. Whether or not Malachy saw the future, his manuscript forces us to confront our present. It asks, if you knew the world were ending, how would you live? If you knew transformation were coming, how would you prepare? If you knew judgment approached, how would you change? These are not questions about the papacy. They are questions about existence itself. In his final years, Pope Benedict XVI, the Gloria Olivae who voluntarily stepped down, reflected on the prophecies in a private conversation with his secretary. According to later accounts, he said, whether Malachy wrote them or not, whether they predict the future or not, they serve a purpose. They remind us that nothing human lasts forever, that institutions are mortal, that only God is eternal. Perhaps that's the real prophecy, not what will happen, but what we must remember. Pope Francis has been less philosophical and more practical. When asked directly about whether he might be the last pope, he reportedly laughed and said, God decides these things, not Irish monks. But if I am the last, then I hope I've served well. And if I'm not, then I hope my successor forgives me for the mess I'm leaving him. The humour is characteristically Francis, but beneath it lies a profound trust. The same trust that has sustained the Church through 2 millennia of crises, reforms, and transformations. The trust that whatever comes next, the spirit that animated Pentecost continues to animate the Church, guiding it not toward a predetermined destination, but into an open future where faith, hope, and love remain the only certainties. On certain quiet mornings in Rome, when the tourists haven't yet filled St. Peter's Square and the vendors haven't yet opened their stalls, you can hear the bells of the basilica with unusual clarity. They ring the hours as they have for centuries, marking time's passage with bronze and sound. Those bells have rung for emperors and paupers, for coronations and funerals, for moments of triumph and seasons of despair. They rang when Luther nailed his theses to a church door. They rang when Napoleon's armies occupied Rome. They rang when the First World War ended and when the Second began. They rang for John Paul I's 33 days and for John Paul II's 27 years. And they will ring again for the next conclave, the next election, the next papacy. Whether that will be the last, as Malachy supposedly predicted, or simply the next in an endless succession, no one can say with certainty. What we know is this: the manuscript exists, the prophecies exist, the pattern exists. And whether that pattern reflects divine foreknowledge, human genius, psychological suggestion, or pure coincidence, it has shaped Catholic consciousness for 9 centuries. It has made popes wonder about their place in history. It has made cardinals think twice about their votes. It has made believers contemplate the end times and skeptics question their skepticism. It has made all of us, Catholic or not, religious or secular, consider what it means to live in a time that believes itself to be the last. Every generation believes it lives at history's climax. Every era thinks itself uniquely important, uniquely threatened, uniquely chosen. The Malachy prophecies tap into that perennial conviction, giving it structure and specificity. They tell us we're not paranoid, we're not deluded. The end really is approaching, and it was written down 800 years ago by a holy man in Ireland. But perhaps the prophecy's real gift is not its prediction, but its invitation. It invites us to live as though our time matters, as though our choices have eternal weight, as though the future depends on how we conduct ourselves in this present moment. If that's true, then it doesn't matter whether Malachy saw the future or fabricated a myth. The manuscript has already achieved its purpose. It has made us pay attention. It has made us ask what we would do with our last days, our final opportunities, our closing chapters. It has made time itself feel precious, urgent, holy. And in that sense, perhaps every prophecy is self-fulfilling, not because it determines the future, but because it transforms the present. We become who we believe we are becoming. We create the future we imagine arriving. The Malachy prophecies have given Catholics a particular imagination of their future, one that involves transformation, tribulation, and judgment, but also mercy, renewal, and hope. Whether that future arrives in our lifetime, or 1,000 years from now, or never at all, may be less important than how that imagination shapes us today. The bells ring on. The manuscript rests in darkness. The Church continues. And somewhere between certainty and mystery, between prophecy and poetry, between the written word and the living moment, we find ourselves still asking the same questions humans have always asked. What comes next? How will it end? And how shall we live until then? The prophecy offers no final answers, only echoes. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the echo itself, that sound of ancient words reverberating through time, growing fainter but never quite disappearing, is all the guidance we need. Listen, and you might hear it still. The sound of an Irish monk's quill scratching parchment by candlelight, writing words that would outlive empires. The sound of Vatican archivists carefully turning pages 9 centuries old. The sound of cardinals voting in the Sistine Chapel, conscious of history's weight upon their shoulders. The sound of pilgrims praying in St. Peter's Square, uncertain of the future but certain of their faith. It all blends together into one continuous sound. Not quite music, not quite speech, but something in between. A murmur, a whisper, a prayer. The sound of prophecy itself, neither true nor false, neither comfort nor warning, but simply present, waiting to be heard, waiting to be understood, waiting to be fulfilled or forgotten, believed or dismissed, but never quite silent. The bells of Rome fall quiet now as the sun rises fully over the ancient city. The tourists arrive, the vendors open, the ordinary day begins. But the echo remains, low, steady, eternal. A sound like breath across parchment. A sound like memory reaching forward. A sound like prophecy turning its final page.